the real-time tremor map. Now, this has been, every day here, guys. We've been talking about different changes in what's going on. Well, we're going to take a look at the list here, and you're going to see clusters of earthquakes that show, tremors, clusters of tremors, which are small microquakes. I call them microquakes. They call them tremors. Same thing. Zeros and ones that are striking up here in the north and down to the south in California. Every day, over the past several days, look at what's gone on over the last 48 hours here. See these, 1, 2, 3 different clusters of earthquakes? If you include up in Vancouver from just over 48 hours ago, there's really 4 clusters of earthquakes. North Vancouver Island, Olympia, Washington, Grants Pass, Oregon, and Redding, California, in between Redding and Wairika. Well, that's 4 spots. What are those 4 spots? Let me show them to you. Take a look at the screen here. Okay, here is the Juan de Fuca fracture zone. And I want you to make note of the North Cascadia subduction zone and where it goes up to. Now, I don't believe in subduction, but we'll call it that. That's what they call it. The swarm of earthquakes that just happened, just over 48 hours ago was right here. Well, look at the fracture zone. Look where it points to. Well, here, let me turn off all my other place marks so you can just see the fracture zone. And let's turn off the Google Earth community. Okay. So now you can see the triangular-shaped fracture zone that goes up to the north, one arm of it, and it goes onto the north part of Vancouver Island. Well, then we come down to the south, and the south part of that triangular fracture zone goes inland to Grants Pass and down into Northern California. Just so happens those are the 2 spots that are swarming. Now you might say, well, what about the spot here at Puget Sound? This is the middle point. If you really look at it, it's kind of a middle point between those 2 zones. And the middle point between those 2 zones, or the northern part of that middle point, started this whole thing to begin with. The whole Olympic Peninsula here swarmed with, I would say thousands total, cumulative, small tremors, and then it shifted to the north, went up here, stopped here, and then transferred to the south. Now here we are. We're back here today. I'm showing you 48 hours worth of earthquakes, and we have multiple cluster points, which to me says the slow slip event is carrying on, or it's picked back up, or it started again, or it's bigger. Those are the options. They said it stopped. The professionals did. The professionals said it stopped. And according to their own blogs, which we read, I went there to find out. I was like, what are they saying? And there it says, well, it looks like it stopped. Well, that was a month ago. We've shown you for the past several weeks at this point that it hasn't stopped, that it's carried on and it's spread. So what I'm concerned here is the more area that we're talking about, the larger region that we're talking about, and the more movement that we're talking about, that's the total cumulative energy. It's more. It's more than what we were looking at back in 2012 when it was just Vancouver Island here. Back in 2012, just Vancouver Island slipped. It slipped for about 6 weeks, and then it was followed by a 7.7 earthquake. Now we're talking about an area 600 miles across, an area that's moving at multiple points at once over the past 48 hours. These are their tremors. This is associated with the slow slip, according to them. When tremors show up here in clusters like this around Seattle and around Washington, they say it's associated with the slow slip and it's nothing to worry about. Okay, I agree with that. That's fine. It is nothing to worry about when it's just one little area and it's just a few dozen to 100 or so earthquakes. But when we're talking about thousands of earthquakes over weeks and weeks of time, over 600 miles, imagine the cumulative total energy that's associated with that and the spots that are in between that haven't moved. What kind of stress they're going to be put under while all these other areas are moving. Even a kid can understand this. You put pressure on all sides of something, well, the other areas that are not being pressed, those areas are going to be moving too. And if you put a lot of pressure on both sides of something, well, what's going to happen to that middle point? I mean, again, engineering will understand this too. You put pressure on this fault. I think that's why this exists to begin with. That's why the fracture zone is shaped the way it is, and that's why it's been there for so long. It's a fulcrum point where pressure comes in. Now it just builds and builds and builds and builds until it releases in a single larger earthquake or a swarm of earthquakes. So if you were to find a halfway point between these zones that are currently showing movement, well, if you look up to the north, again, I told you have to imagine a swarm of earthquakes up here at North Vancouver Island from just over 48 hours ago. If you watched last night's update, you'll remember it. So, okay, so that's 2 spots to the north and 2 spots to the south, right? What about the middle point? Coast of Oregon. Off the coast of Oregon. Let's get back and look what's off the coast of Oregon. Look where it goes. Here, let's get our line measurement tool so you can really see. off the coast of Central Oregon. Boom, puts us right to that fulcrum point, which just so happens to be a spot that got hit a couple of years ago when I first got into it with the professor from the Pacific Northwest. Professor John Vidali from the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network came to my pages. He sought me out. I didn't seek him out. He came to me, said all kinds of nasty stuff, and we issued a warning for the West Coast within a couple weeks of him getting into it with us, and we warned this spot right here. And then it was followed with a 6.0 earthquake, and you can see the date on here, okay? June 2nd, 2015. And it struck at the cleft segment. Now, again, here we are again, and we're talking about the same location again, and this time we have slow slips happening on both sides, not just regular incoming earthquake pressure like we'd issue a forecast for. So slow slip is an entirely different beast. It's an entirely different event. It's happening over weeks and weeks and weeks. I normally issue 3 to 5, maybe 7-day forecasts. So when we're talking about weeks and weeks, I have to watch it on a day-by-day basis and tell you what I see what's going on. So if I'm going to look for something to strike, I'm going to look for it to strike between Northern California, off the coast of the Gorda Escarpment, up to the coast of Oregon. It's a small stretch. It's not the whole west coast of the United States. Now, earthquake size, I mean, look, it's going to be bigger, most likely, than what hit in 2012. Why do I say that? Thousands of earthquakes as opposed to hundreds. 600 miles as opposed to 100 miles moving. Time frame, 8 weeks now as opposed to 6. One of the longer slow slip events, or that the slow slip is picking back up. See, here's another option, is that the slow slip is picking back up, and we're going to see the sucker really start to roll again, and we won't see a larger earthquake until that's done. But overall, when it's done, we've seen this happen time after time. This is not my take on it. It's just historical fact that when the slow slips finish, there is a larger earthquake that usually follows. Now, sometimes they're not huge earthquakes. Sometimes they're just in the 6 range, like what I told you about in 2015. But we go back to 2012, and then there's a 7.7. You go back to 2011 in Japan, and there's a 9.0 accompanying those slow slip events. So that's why I've got to talk about it. Also, I would like to point out to you, there are no earthquakes being reported in the last 24 hours, not even a 0.0 anywhere across Oregon. Not even an explosion, not even a quarry blast, nothing. Complete silence off the coast and everything. So if there's no earthquake striking there, that also means it's silent zone. It's a spot where there's pressure building. Just so happens to be the Juan de Fuca fracture zone and one of the biggest megathrust locations where we might see a large earthquake that pushes up, causes a buckling in the plate, and we don't want to see that happen. But the longer we go here and the larger it gets, the more incoming pressure there is, and we're talking about 6s over across Alaska at this point over the past several days. This is just 24 hours worth of earthquakes. Okay? So, that being said, west coast of the United States, we are 1 day away from me canceling the watch for the west coast. Or, I'm sorry, the warning for the west coast. And we will take it down strictly to a watch. A watch is way less serious. A watch is where we just keep our eyes peeled for it, but you go about your daily business. You have your plans still, of course, but you don't have anything by the door. You're not going to be sleeping, waiting up at night for it. We're going to give it, like I said, 10 days. 10 days from the point where I originally started talking about this, and I'm cutting it off there because I'm not going to keep warning you for the slow slip that keeps going on. Now, I'm going to talk about it every night until the slow slip stops. But again, evidence speaks for itself. This is 48 hours worth of earthquakes, or tremors, associated with what I would call the slow slip region. Slow slip region, Northern California, Oregon, Washington. If you live on the coast from Seattle down to Redding, California, you need to be on watch. Not because I'm saying so, because look at the screen. It's just I'm making you aware that the slow slip is still carrying on, or it started again, or it's spread. I would like to hear the professionals' take on it. Them just to say, oh, it's just random? No, it can't be random. It's gone on for weeks now where it's spread out across this entire region. It went from just one little spot to 3 to 4 spots. And that's of concern to me and to anybody else who's into these large plate events. You can't get a large section of a plate moving and not see some compensation movement either at the middle point or on either side, right? Just makes perfect logical, physical, Newtonian sense for that to take place. We see it happen across the planet on a semi-monthly to yearly basis in some areas across the planet. Okay,